The Most Insane Victorian Facts, Part 1. In Victorian times, death wasn't hidden. It was embraced, ritualized, and sometimes photographed. When a loved one passed away, families didn't just mourn, they posed. Postmortem photography became a surprisingly common way to remember the dead. Cameras were expensive, and for many families, this would be the only image ever taken of their loved one. So they dressed the deceased in their finest clothes, propped them up in lifelike poses, and sat beside them, often with solemn pride. Some were laid in beds to appear peacefully asleep. Others were posed standing with the help of hidden stands and wires. Photographers even painted color onto pale cheeks to make them look more alive. To modernize, the results can feel deeply unsettling. Often the living subjects in the photo are slightly blurred. They moved, while the dead remain perfectly still. But to Victorians, these images weren't morbid. They were deeply meaningful keepsakes, framed on mantles or tucked into lockets, a way to keep the memory literally close to heart. In an age before digital albums and selfies, a photograph with the dead was a final sacred portrait. In the 1800s, the ideal woman was pale, almost ghostly. Tanned skin meant you worked under the sun. But if you were wealthy, delicate, and porcelain-skinned, that was true beauty. So some women and men turned to poison. Arsenic wafers, sold at apothecaries and in fashion magazines, promised to purify the skin. With regular use, they claimed you'd glow with a flawless, milky white complexion. All you had to do was eat poison. It wasn't just a little arsenic either. These wafers could trigger hair loss, organ damage, vomiting, even death. But the advertising was seductive. Arsenic would brighten the eyes, smooth out the skin, and clear blemishes, at least until it started killing you from the inside out. Some people went further, mixing arsenic with vinegar and chalk to create homemade skin creams. Others drank water infused with arsenic drops. Doctors warned against it, but demand only grew. It became a silent arms race. Who could look the palest without falling over? Eventually, as medical science advanced and the dangers became undeniable, arsenic fell out of favor. But for decades, being drop-dead gorgeous was disturbingly literal. In Victorian England, love and sacrifice weren't just poetic ideals. They often came with blood, pain, and a forced smile. Among the poor, when families couldn't afford a proper wedding gift, daughters sometimes offered something shockingly personal: their teeth. Tooth decay was rampant among the upper class thanks to sugar-rich diets and crude dental hygiene. Dentures were in high demand, and nothing looked better or lasted longer than real human teeth. But there were no sterile clinics or regulated donations. The supply chain was darker than most would guess. Some teeth came from battlefields, yanked from the mouths of dead soldiers and sold as Waterloo teeth. Others were pulled from corpses in morgues or even graveyards. But the most unsettling source? The living poor, often women, who sold their own teeth for a few shillings. Sometimes as part of a dowry, sometimes just to eat. In letters and journals, you'll find accounts of women giving their teeth as a romantic gesture. Some brides even had their teeth removed before marriage, believing dentures made of strangers' teeth would look more refined than their own. It was a brutal kind of gift, painful, permanent, and silent. But in a world obsessed with appearances, a flawless smile built on someone else's suffering was just another part of the costume. Behind every polished grin, a story of poverty, devotion, and a bite of quiet tragedy. In Victorian times, a woman's hairstyle wasn't just fashion, it was architecture. These towering hairdos, often propped up with pads, wires, and horsehair, could rise several inches above the scalp and stay untouched for weeks. But beauty came at a cost. As these elaborate styles grew in size and complexity, so did a very specific fear: that rodents, particularly mice, might crawl in and nest among the curls and cushions. It wasn't entirely baseless. With hygiene standards questionable and bathing seen as risky, hair was often left unwashed for long periods. Add to that a bit of food powder for scent or styling, and you had the perfect urban legend breeding ground. Stories circulated, some real, some exaggerated, of women fainting in church only to discover a nest of mice hiding in their coiffure. The fear was so widespread that some women began sleeping in protective caps or brushing their hair obsessively, not for cleanliness, but to make sure no furry squatters had moved in overnight. In a world obsessed with poise and appearance, nothing undercut elegance quite like a mouse making itself at home in your hairdo. In Victorian Britain, few events drew a crowd like a public hanging. These weren't somber legal proceedings hidden behind prison gates. They were theatrical spectacles. Massive crowds would gather outside jails at dawn, families arriving early with picnic baskets, jostling for the best view. Street vendors sold hot pies, gin flowed freely, and children sat on shoulders, eyes wide with anticipation. This wasn't justice, it was the day's entertainment. The condemned, often shackled and pale, were led out before the crowd like tragic actors. Some cursed the onlookers, others wept or prayed. As the executioner adjusted the noose, silence would fall, followed by a collective gasp or cheer the moment the trapdoor gave way. The most morbid fans surged forward after the hanging, tearing at the noose for souvenirs, believing a piece of the rope could bring luck or cure illness. Newspapers ran breathless accounts. Engravers sold images of the moment. For some, it was a moral lesson. For others, it was blood sport. By 1868, even hardened officials admitted the spectacle had become grotesque. That year, Britain outlawed public executions, moving them behind prison walls. But for decades, the gallows had been a stage, and death the performance. Step inside a Victorian hospital, and you weren't entering a place of healing. You were stepping onto a stage for agony. Surgeons stood in blood-crusted coats, not out of necessity, but pride. A stained apron was seen as a badge of honor, a mark of experience. Surgical tools, dulled from use, were rarely cleaned. There were no gloves, no masks, and no concept of sterilization. Germ theory hadn't caught on, so infections spread like wildfire. Doctors would go from examining corpses to delivering babies without even washing their hands. In fact, maternity wards became death traps. Entire wings were wiped out by childbed fever, a deadly infection spread by the very hands meant to help. One Hungarian physician, Ignaz Semmelweis, suggested doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime. He was mocked and driven to madness for it. Amputations were common, not because they were always necessary, but because wounds got infected so quickly. Surgeons raced to saw off limbs in under 2 minutes. Any longer, and the patient might die from the pain alone. There were no reliable anesthetics early on, so patients were held down by assistants, awake and screaming as the bone saw bit into flesh. And the prescriptions? They were just as horrifying. Mercury was used for everything from sore throats to syphilis, despite the fact it slowly poisoned patients. Arsenic was marketed as a tonic. Cocaine, heroin, and opium were freely given out for coughs, anxiety, or simply to calm the nerves. Mental health treatment was worse. Women labeled with hysteria were subjected to humiliating procedures, pelvic massages, forced isolation, or ice-cold dunk baths. Asylums used mechanical restraints, purgatives, and sometimes spinning chairs to shake madness loose. In the Victorian age, medicine wasn't a science, it was trial by fire. And more often than not, the cure was just as deadly as the disease.